The day my grandmother's attorney called, I was standing in the parking garage at the building where I'd just been told my services were no longer needed. My key card deactivated, my laptop taken from my hands, my access badge clipped from my lanyard by my own brother-in-law while my mother-in-law watched from the doorway like she was supervising a routine task. 14 years. That's how long I had worked at Whitmore Consulting, the firm my grandmother built from a single desk in a rented office in 1979. 14 years of 60-hour weeks, of skipped vacations, of learning the industry from the floor up because she asked me to. And it took them exactly 22 minutes to escort me out. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket as I sat in my car trying to remember how to breathe. Unknown number, local area code. I almost didn't answer. Is this Cecile Ashton? The voice was older, measured, professional in the way that costs money. I told him it was. My name is Gareth Lowe. I'm an estate attorney. I believe I owe you a conversation that's been a long time coming. Your grandmother, Doris Whitmore, asked me to contact you directly in the event of a specific set of circumstances. He paused. I understand those circumstances may have occurred today. I stared at the concrete pillar in front of my car. I said, "How did you know about today?" "Because your grandmother anticipated it," he said quietly. "Can you come to my office?" I should back up. My grandmother raised me. My parents divorced when I was 4, remarried other people quickly, and somehow I ended up the child that didn't quite fit in either new household. Grandma Doris, small, sharp-eyed, smelling of gardenia and printer ink, took me in without ceremony or complaint. She enrolled me in school, taught me how to read a balance sheet before I understood fractions, and told me every Sunday that the women in our family built things from nothing and that I would be no different. When I was 22, fresh out of college with a finance degree, she offered me a position at Whitmore Consulting. I would start at the bottom. I would earn every promotion. I would learn what the company actually was before I had any claim on what it could become. What I didn't know then was that 2 years earlier, my grandmother had married again, a widower named Harlan. Quiet, soft-spoken, always with a smile that sat slightly too still on his face. He had a son from his first marriage, my stepfather-in-law's age, and a daughter-in-law who had worked in corporate acquisitions and knew exactly what Whitmore Consulting was worth. I was 24 when I met my husband, Matthias. He was warm and funny, and I loved him for a long time before I understood that love doesn't inoculate you against being used. His mother was the daughter-in-law. Her name was Carmel, and from the first time she shook my hand at a family dinner, she looked at me the way a chess player looks at a piece that's not yet where they need it to be. I didn't see it. That's the part I have to sit with. By the time I was 30, I was a senior director at Whitmore. By 32, my grandmother was sick. The kind of sick that is quiet at first and then isn't. She moved slower. She deferred more. And Carmel, who had somehow become indispensable in those years, began attending every family meeting, every doctor's appointment, every dinner where financial decisions got discussed. I tried to visit more. Carmel was always there first. I tried calling. Grandma Doris seemed tired in ways I couldn't quite locate. One afternoon, about 8 months before she died, I found a moment alone with her in the sunroom of her house. Matthias was in the kitchen with his mother. I sat beside her and held her hand, and she looked at me with those sharp eyes that had never once been soft when she could help it. And she said something I've replayed every day since. "Cece, I need you to trust me even when it doesn't look like you should." I told her, of course. I asked what she meant. She squeezed my hand. "I've been doing what I can from where I am." Then Carmel's heels clicked back down the hallway and Grandma Doris let go of my hand and picked up her tea like we'd been talking about nothing. She died 4 months later. The will, read at a family gathering that felt staged from the first moment, left the company in a restructured trust. Harlan was named trustee. Carmel was named operational director. I was given a standard employee severance package and a framed photo from Grandma Doris's desk. Matthias told me it was what she wanted. His mother told me I should be grateful Doris had considered me at all, given that I wasn't technically family. I wasn't technically family. I had lived in that woman's house. I had learned to drive in her parking lot. I had cried over my first breakup in her kitchen while she made tea and told me that grief was just proof something mattered, and I was not technically family. I stayed at the company because I didn't know what else to do, and because some part of me believed if I just kept working, kept being indispensable, things would right themselves. That's the lie people like Carmel count on, that the people they've wronged will keep showing up anyway. I showed up for another 2 years. And then, on the same morning, the board voted to accept a private equity offer that Carmel had been quietly arranging for months, an offer that would dissolve the trust structure and transfer ownership entirely. I was escorted out of the building by my own brother-in-law with my key card already deactivated. That was when Gareth Lowe called. His office was in a brownstone 20 minutes from the Whitmore building. Dark wood, tall windows, bookshelves that looked consulted rather than decorative. He was in his 60s, unhurried, with the kind of careful stillness that reminded me of Grandma Doris. He poured coffee without asking. "Your grandmother came to me 3 years ago," he said, settling across from me. She was very specific about the timing of this conversation. I wrapped my hands around the mug. 3 years ago she was already sick. She was already worried, he said. There's a difference. He opened a file on his desk. "Before I show you anything, I need to verify your identity and complete a biometric confirmation," she requested. He slid a form across the desk. Standard. She was thorough. I signed. He scanned. He turned back to his computer, and I watched something shift in his expression, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. Just a small tightening, a steadying, like someone bracing before they say something that will change the room. "Your grandmother left you something," he said, "but I want to be careful about how I explain what it is, because the structure is unusual and I don't want you to misunderstand the scope." I said, "Just tell me." He turned the monitor toward me. The first thing I saw was my name, Cecile Ann Ashton, listed as primary beneficiary under a document called the Whitmore Legacy Protection Trust, entirely separate from the restructured trust Harlan had been named to oversee. Gareth explained slowly, watching my face, that my grandmother had established this trust 6 years ago with an independent trustee. It held no operational assets from the consulting firm. What it held was everything else. The building where Whitmore Consulting had operated for 30 years. Grandma Doris owned it outright. I had never known that. Carmel hadn't known it either, which is why the private equity sale was already in legal jeopardy. You cannot sell a company's operating lease to a buyer without disclosing that you don't own the building, and the building's owner had just walked into an attorney's office. There were also investments, long-term holdings in a real estate fund, a stake in a regional bank, 2 commercial properties in the city where I'd grown up. Not generational wealth in the way people imagine it, no offshore accounts, no dynasty numbers, but solid, significant, the kind of money that could quietly, thoroughly restructure a person's options. "How much?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Gareth told me. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, "They didn't know about any of this." "That was the point," he said. "Your grandmother was very deliberate. She kept this entirely separate from every account, every document, every conversation that Carmel or Harlan had access to." I thought about Grandma Doris's hands around her teacup in the sunroom. "I need you to trust me even when it doesn't look like you should." She had known they were listening. She had said what she could from where she was, and trusted me to hold on until it was time. I pressed my hand flat against the desk and breathed. "There's something else," Gareth said, and he opened a second folder. Older manila, sealed with a sticker that had my name written on it in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside the folder was a letter and a series of documents. I read the letter first. I'll summarize because some of what she wrote was private in a way that still belongs only to me. But the core of it was this. My grandmother had watched for years as Harlan's family maneuvered around her, and she had understood clearly what they wanted and what they were willing to do to get it. She had not confronted them. Confrontation would have accelerated things and given them time to adapt. Instead, she had worked quietly, methodically, with Gareth and one other person she trusted, to separate what was mine from what they might reach. She wrote, "I could not protect you from the hurt of the next few years, but I could protect you from the permanent damage they intended. That distinction matters. The hurt is real. The damage is not yours to carry." The documents behind the letter were something else entirely. Transaction records, emails. A formal complaint she had filed with the State Business Regulatory Office 18 months before she died, before she was too sick to file anything herself, alleging that Carmel had manipulated financial reporting within the company in order to artificially lower the firm's valuation in advance of a planned acquisition she stood to profit from directly. My grandmother had suspected the private equity deal was being engineered while she was still alive, and she had started building the case against it. Gareth gave me time with the documents before he spoke again. When he did, he told me that the complaint she had filed was still active, that the regulatory inquiry had been quietly ongoing, that her death had not closed the case, and that my possession of these documents, combined with the building ownership I had just confirmed, meant I had standing to intervene in the sale before it finalized. I looked up from the papers. "If I intervene," I said, "they'll come after me." "Yes," Gareth said simply. "What do I do?" He reached into a drawer and placed a business card on the desk. "Nadia Osi. She's a litigation attorney. She's been briefed on the broad strokes. Your grandmother specifically requested her." I picked up the card. It was heavy, the kind that cost something. "One more thing," Gareth said. He cleared his throat in a way that told me this was the part he'd been building toward. "I need to tell you about the building lease. Whitmore Consulting has been operating on a month-to-month lease for the last 8 months. He looked at me carefully. "Your grandmother's trust, your trust, has the right to renegotiate or terminate at 30 days' notice." The room was very quiet. "Carmel's sale," I said slowly. "The private equity deal cannot close," Gareth confirmed, "without a valid long-term lease. And the leaseholder is sitting across from me." Nadia Osei's office was on the 14th floor of a downtown building with clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows. She was younger than I expected, 40 at most, with the kind of focused energy that made the room rearrange itself around her. She shook my hand and said, "I've been looking forward to this conversation. Your grandmother spoke highly of you." I sat down and tried not to look like someone who had been crying in a parking garage 4 hours ago. Nadia walked me through the timeline in clear, brisk language. The regulatory complaint was still active. The sale structure had vulnerabilities beyond the building issue. And there was evidence. In my grandmother's documents and in filings Nadia had already obtained through discovery requests, that Carmel had used company funds in the months following my grandmother's death to pay for services related to the acquisition planning. That was a breach of fiduciary duty, potentially criminal. "They were counting on you not knowing any of this," Nadia said. "I didn't," I said. "They also counted on you staying." She looked at me evenly. "You stayed longer than they expected. That actually helped. You were in the building. You were watching even if you didn't know what you were watching for. Some of what's in your regulatory filing, your grandmother's filing, is corroborated by operational reports you signed off on. Reports that contain inconsistencies that only make sense now." I thought about the quarterly summaries I'd flagged twice in the last year. The numbers that hadn't lined up the way I expected. Carmel had told me the accounting team had updated their methodology. I had moved on. "What do we do?" I said. "We file a motion to halt the sale pending resolution of the regulatory inquiry," Nadia said. "That's our first move, and we do it today because the sale is scheduled to close in 11 days. They'll know it's me." "Yes. And when they do, they'll likely try to negotiate." She leaned forward. "I want you to understand something. They have options, but they're not good ones. The building issue alone is enough to crater the deal. The fiduciary breach adds personal liability for Carmel. The regulatory complaint, filed by your grandmother, not by you, gives us a position that is very difficult to attack." My phone buzzed. "Matthias." I looked at the screen for a moment and then turned it face down on the desk. Nadia noticed. She didn't comment. "What happens to my marriage?" I said. It wasn't really a question, but I needed to say it aloud in a room with another person. She was quiet for a beat. "That's not a legal question, but I will tell you that the legal process doesn't require you to make that decision today." I nodded. We went back to work. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life, and also the most clarifying. Nadia filed the motion. The sale froze. Carmel called me 4 times. My brother-in-law sent 2 emails that my grandmother's filing made very clear I should not respond to. Matthias left a voicemail that I listened to twice and then forwarded to Nadia without commenting. What surprised me most was what I felt. Not relief. Not yet. Not anger, though that was there too. Mostly, I felt something I didn't have a good word for. A kind of structural clarity, like a building after a fog lifts and you can finally see the whole shape of it. My grandmother had built something and they had tried to take it, and she had spent the last years of her life making sure they couldn't. She hadn't told me. That was the part I had to work through in the gaps between phone calls and filings and the logistics of my own sudden homelessness, because Matthias had sent a text, not a voicemail, a text, informing me he thought it was best if I stayed elsewhere for now. I had 3 bags and my grandmother's folder and a hotel room that cost more per night than I wanted to think about. She had not told me because telling me would have changed how I acted, and if I had acted differently, they would have known. And if they had known, they would have moved faster, hidden things more carefully, done whatever necessary to stay ahead of the case my grandmother was quietly building from her sunroom. She had protected me by not telling me. And it had cost her, cost both of us, something real. I sat in the hotel room on the second night and read her letter again. I cried in a way I hadn't since her funeral, the kind of crying that has more than one thing in it at once. Then I called Gareth and asked him to walk me through next steps. 3 weeks later, Nadia stood in a conference room with Carmel's attorneys across the table and laid out what we had with the calm specificity of someone who had been building to this moment for months. The regulatory inquiry had advanced. The fiduciary breach evidence was substantial. The building situation had already forced the private equity firm to withdraw. They had their own legal exposure to manage, and no appetite for a complicated dispute with a beneficiary who held the deed. Carmel's plan, constructed over years and implemented with precision, had a foundation that my grandmother had quietly removed 18 months before she died. What Nadia presented was not a threat, it was an accounting. These are the facts. These are the legal options. These are the consequences of each path. Carmel's attorneys asked for a recess. They took 40 minutes. When they came back, the lead attorney said they were prepared to discuss a settlement framework. I didn't say anything. Nadia had told me not to. I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the table and waited. The settlement took another 3 weeks to finalize. I won't list every term. But I will say this. The consulting firm, without the building and without the sale, needed to be restructured. The restructuring required new leadership, and the terms of the settlement included a formal acknowledgement, signed, notarized, filed with the court, that my dismissal had been retaliatory and unlawful, and that I was owed damages accordingly. Carmel resigned. Her husband, Harlan's son, my once brother-in-law, submitted his resignation the same week. Harlan, elderly and genuinely confused about much of what had happened, was removed as trustee through a separate proceeding. He bore less blame than the others. My grandmother had understood that too. Her letter was careful about it. Matthias and I finalized our separation 4 months later. It was sad in the way that endings of long things are sad, even when they are right. He was not Carmel. He had been shaped by her, influenced by her in ways I don't think he fully understood, but he was not her. Our marriage had been real, and now it was over, and both of those things were true at the same time. I moved into one of my grandmother's commercial properties, a mixed-use building with a residential unit on the top floor that had sat empty for 2 years because the previous tenant had relocated. I painted the walls a color she would have called impractical, and I would have agreed with her out loud and ignored in private. I bought plants. I put her photo on the windowsill where it got light in the mornings. I went back to work, not at Whitmore, The restructured firm had new leadership and a different name and a future I wasn't part of. I started something smaller, a consulting practice of my own, with 2 clients I had worked with for years and who had called me within a week of my dismissal to say they wanted to follow me wherever I landed. It was slow at first. Most right things are. Some mornings I would stand at the window with coffee and think about the conversation in the sunroom. I need you to trust me even when it doesn't look like you should. She had known that was a lot to ask. She had asked anyway, and I had held on, not even knowing what I was holding on to just because she asked me to. That's the thing about people who love you well. They don't always get to explain themselves. Sometimes the explanation comes later, in a folder in an attorney's office, in a letter written with the kind of care that takes years. I still talk to Gareth occasionally. He sends a card every December. Nadia, I see more often. She's become someone I would call a friend, though we arrived at that through a strange door. I visit my grandmother's grave when I need to think through something complicated. I don't say much. I bring the same flowers every time. The kind she grew in her garden, gardenias, slightly impractical for a city plot. But I've made it work. I tell her she was right. I tell her I'm building something. I tell her it's going to be okay. And I believe it now, which I didn't for a long time, and which feels, more than the settlement, more than the building deed, more than any of it, like the thing she actually wanted to leave me.